The mountains of Appalachia have always known how to keep secrets. Fog settles into the valleys like a held breath, and the trees listen longer than they speak. Long before highways cut through the ridgelines and schoolbooks flattened history into neat paragraphs, there were stories whispered in kitchens after the lamps were turned low. Stories that never made it into classrooms. Stories that did not want to be remembered. In county archives and condemned school basements, there are gaps where lessons should be. Entire decades reduced to a sentence. Names scratched out. Margins burned black. What remains is not ignorance, but intention. Someone decided these stories were too heavy for young minds, too dangerous for public memory, too capable of spreading once spoken aloud. And so they were sealed away under the gentler label of folklore, as if that word could dull their teeth. But folklore does not mean fiction in these mountains. It means survival. It means warning. It means a record kept by people who had no reason to invent horror when daily life provided enough of its own. Children vanished into coal seams that were never reopened. Families erased by accusations that arrived faster than the law ever did. Communities that learned, too late, what happens when fear is allowed to teach in place of truth. The schools taught dates and diagrams, but they never taught why certain roads end abruptly, or why some hollers have no graveyards despite generations having lived there. They never explained why elders fall silent when specific years are mentioned, or why some lullabies were banned from being sung outside the home. Silence became the curriculum, and forgetting was graded as success. These are the stories that slipped through that silence. Stories buried not because they were untrue, but because they revealed something uncomfortable about cruelty, faith, power, and what people are capable of when no one is watching. Stories that were never meant to leave the mountains, and certainly never meant to be taught. Once you hear them, you begin to understand why. The discovery began in a place never meant to be searched, a condemned county school building scheduled for demolition, its windows boarded and its halls thick with chalk dust and rot. What drew attention was not what was present, but what was missing. Entire shelves where textbooks should have been sat empty, their wooden frames scarred with outlines of books long removed. In a locked storage room beneath the auditorium, there were boxes marked only with dates, many of them overlapping years that were conspicuously thin in official records. Inside were lesson plans that stopped mid-paragraph, attendance sheets with entire classes crossed out in red pencil, and handwritten notes warning future educators to skip this section entirely. These were not the careless losses of time or neglect, but deliberate acts of removal carried out with quiet precision. As more archives were examined, the pattern repeated itself. Rural schools across multiple Appalachian counties had identical gaps, the same years reduced to vague summaries, the same local incidents omitted without explanation. Journals kept by teachers, some written in cramped, hurried handwriting, spoke of directives handed down without documentation, of supervisors who arrived unannounced and left with boxes of materials never returned. In several cases, educators noted that they were instructed to replace real events with sanitized legends or geography lessons, as though memory itself could be overwritten by repetition. Oral histories filled in what paper refused to hold. Former students recalled entire weeks where no lessons were taught, where classrooms were dismissed early and questions were discouraged at home. Elderly residents remembered seeing trucks arrive at schools late at night, headlights off, loading crates that were never inventoried. One retired librarian admitted that certain books were removed not by fire or decay, but by hand, stamped inappropriate for instruction and stored where no catalogue could find them. The language used was always the same, vague enough to sound reasonable, firm enough to prevent argument. What emerged from these fragments was not a single censored story, but a coordinated erasure. Incidents involving violence, exploitation, mass hysteria, and institutional failure were stripped from curricula under the justification of protecting children, yet the children who lived through those years remembered anyway. The banned materials suggested that these stories threatened more than innocence, they threatened reputations, local power structures, and the comforting myth that the mountains were merely poor, not wounded. The act of uncovering these records revealed that education had been used not just to teach, but to conceal, and that the silence surrounding Appalachia's darkest chapters was not accidental but carefully taught generation after generation. As the scattered documents were laid side by side, A disturbing consistency revealed itself, one that could not be explained by coincidence or localized oversight. Records from different Appalachian states, separated by hundreds of miles and governed by entirely different school boards, showed the same chronological gaps. Entire years vanished simultaneously from curricula in Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and parts of Virginia, as if an invisible hand had swept across the region and erased memory in a single motion. Textbooks printed in those years contained abrupt shifts in narrative, jumping from one decade to the next with no acknowledgement of what had occurred in between, leaving students to assume that nothing of consequence had happened at all. The timing of these omissions aligned too precisely to ignore. Letters from education departments, when they survived at all, referenced revisions and updates, yet never specified content changes. Meeting minutes recorded unanimous votes without debate, suggesting that decisions had been made long before anyone entered the room. In some districts, the same substitute materials appeared, photocopied packets that replaced entire chapters, focusing on weather patterns, mineral resources, or patriotic generalities rather than local history. Teachers who noticed the substitutions were warned that questioning them would jeopardize their positions, a threat quietly reinforced by the sudden disappearance of colleagues who pressed too hard. More unsettling was how the erasures mirrored one another in detail. Specific names were removed across state lines. Certain locations were consistently omitted from maps. Events that appeared briefly in newspapers during their time vanished entirely from educational references within a year. It suggested coordination at a level far beyond individual communities, an agreement that some truths were too volatile to be handled openly. The mountains, often portrayed as isolated and disconnected, were in this case bound together by a shared silence enforced through bureaucratic routine. Former curriculum editors later admitted, off the record, that directives arrived already finalized, accompanied by warnings not to ask where they came from. The language used was always protective in tone, emphasizing stability and unity, yet the effect was fragmentation. Students grew up unaware that neighboring counties had endured nearly identical traumas during the same years. Without context, rumors became superstition, and history decayed into ghost stories told without dates or causes. This systematic disappearance reshaped collective memory. When an entire region is taught the same omissions, absence becomes normalized. People sense that something is missing but lack the vocabulary to describe it. The repetition of erasure across states ensured that no single community could point to another and demand answers, because everyone had been taught the same incomplete version of the past. What emerged was a manufactured continuity, smooth on the surface, but hollow beneath, maintained by the quiet understanding that some events were never meant to be remembered, let alone taught. When the investigation moved beyond paper and into the living memory of the mountains, resistance surfaced almost immediately. In towns tucked deep into hollers where roads narrowed and phone signals vanished, elders listened politely to questions and then turned their faces away, their expressions tightening in ways that suggested fear rather than ignorance. Many had outlived wars, depressions, and disasters, yet the mention of certain years or places caused their voices to lower instinctively. Some insisted they remembered nothing at all, while others offered carefully neutral anecdotes that ended abruptly, as though an invisible line had been crossed. The refusal was never loud or confrontational, it was quiet, practiced, and deeply ingrained. Those who did speak used language shaped by caution. Stories were framed as warnings rather than recollections, stripped of names and dates. An old man might say that the mountain took back what it was owed or that a family forgot how to mind itself, phrases that concealed more than they revealed. When pressed for clarity, the same phrase surfaced again and again, spoken almost verbatim across different communities. Some stories do not stay buried once told. It was not delivered as metaphor, but as a statement of fact, as if history itself were capable of retaliation. The fear was not abstract. Several elders recalled what happened to those who talked too much decades earlier. They spoke of neighbors who were shunned overnight, of houses that burned under unclear circumstances, of sudden illnesses that arrived after a story spread too far. Whether these consequences were coincidence, communal punishment, or something more unsettling was never clarified, only implied. The mountains, in their telling, were not passive backdrops but witnesses that remembered everything, even when people tried not to. What became clear was that silence had been taught as survival. Parents instructed children to forget certain questions. Churches redirected curiosity toward faith when explanations grew uncomfortable. Schools reinforced this discipline by omission, ensuring that what was never named could not be easily discussed. Over generations, the habit of withholding became instinctive, and memory itself was reshaped to avoid dangerous edges. Even those who wanted to speak struggled to organize their thoughts, as though language had eroded where truth once lived. This collective refusal was not born from superstition alone, but from lived experience. Elders understood that stories have weight, and that repeating them can awaken consequences that outlast the teller. Their warnings suggested that the past was not finished, only dormant, waiting for the wrong voice at the wrong time. In Appalachia, remembering was not always an act of preservation, sometimes it was an invitation, and not everything that hears its name spoken is willing to remain silent. The paper trail surrounding the teachers who attempted to address the missing history was thin to the point of suspicion, but the few surviving records spoke volumes through their absence. Personnel files showed abrupt endings with no disciplinary explanations, contracts that simply were not renewed, and transfer notices that reassigned educators to distant districts without request or appeal. In some cases, names vanished entirely from employment rosters as if the individuals had never taught there at all. What linked these cases was timing. Each dismissal followed closely after classroom discussions, reading assignments, or student questions that drifted too near the erased years. Former colleagues remembered the atmosphere shifting almost overnight. A teacher might mention an unapproved local incident during a lesson, only to find an administrator sitting silently in the back of the room the following day. Lesson plans were suddenly subject to review, and informal observations became frequent and unannounced. Warnings, when given, were vague and framed as concern for professionalism or community harmony. No one was accused outright of wrongdoing, yet the message was clear enough to be understood without being stated. Several retired educators later admitted that they had been encouraged to keep their distance from certain co-workers, as association itself carried risk. Breakroom conversations ended abruptly when specific topics arose, and materials were quietly removed from shared cabinets. One teacher recalled returning to her classroom to find her personal notes gone, replaced by a memo reminding her of curriculum standards and the importance of consistency across districts. Another remembered being told that local history was best left to families, not schools, despite having been hired specifically to teach it. What made these dismissals particularly effective was their quiet nature. There were no public controversies, no lawsuits, no community meetings. Teachers were simply gone, their departures explained away as personal decisions or budgetary adjustments. Students noticed, of course, but learned quickly not to ask why. Over time, this pattern trained both educators and learners to avoid curiosity. The consequences of speaking became more instructive than any formal policy ever could be. The loss extended beyond individual careers. Each dismissed teacher took with them knowledge, context, and the possibility of inquiry. Their absence reinforced the idea that history had boundaries enforced not by evidence, but by authority. Younger teachers, observing what happened to their predecessors, learned to stay within the safe margins of approved material. In this way, silence replicated itself, passed down through professional caution rather than written rule. The classroom, meant to be a place of exploration, became another site where omission was enforced, and where the cost of telling the truth was demonstrated not through punishment, but through erasure. Amid the fragments and omissions, one story surfaced repeatedly without ever fully revealing itself, a presence felt more than seen. It appeared as a shadow in footnotes, a repeated redaction in reports, a phrase crossed out so heavily the paper tore beneath the ink. Teachers' journals referenced it obliquely, using phrases like the incident we are not to name or what happened beyond the ridge, as if even writing it down risked consequences. Unlike other events that were partially documented before disappearing, this one seemed to have been suppressed almost immediately, leaving behind only the evidence of deliberate concealment. Oral accounts hinted at it with even greater unease. Elders who otherwise refused to speak would occasionally allude to something that changed the mountains themselves, something that altered how communities trusted one another. The language was coded and symbolic, relying on metaphor rather than detail. A preacher mentioned a year when prayers were said for forgiveness without anyone admitting what had been done. A midwife recalled a season when births were not celebrated but counted with fear. Each reference pointed toward a single, unnamed event that had fractured normal life so completely that naming it felt impossible. What distinguished this story from the others was its universality. While many banned incidents were tied to specific towns or families, this one seemed to echo across counties and state lines. Different communities described its aftermath in similar terms: sudden disappearances, records sealed without explanation, and a collective agreement to behave as though a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. The consistency suggested not rumor, but shared experience, yet no two accounts ever matched closely enough to form a complete picture. It was as if the truth existed only in pieces, scattered deliberately so it could never be assembled. The absence of written documentation was itself a clue. Newspaper archives from the period showed irregular publication gaps and unusually short issues. Church ledgers skipped months. Census data listed anomalies that were never corrected. These silences converged around the same narrow window of time, reinforcing the sense that something had occurred that demanded erasure at every level of record-keeping. Even legal documents avoided specifics, referring only to extraordinary circumstances without elaboration. Over time, the unnamed story became a gravitational center around which other suppressed narratives revolved. It shaped policy decisions, justified censorship, and reinforced the belief that some knowledge was inherently dangerous. The fear surrounding it was not theatrical or exaggerated, it was practical, rooted in the understanding that certain truths, once spoken, could unravel the fragile agreements that allowed communities to continue existing side by side. The story remained unwritten not because it lacked witnesses, but because everyone who remembered it understood the cost of being the one who finally gave it a name. The mountains themselves held evidence that no archive or journal could fully capture. Walking the ridgelines and descending into hollows, the narrator began to encounter physical traces of the stories that had been erased from textbooks and official memory. Abandoned cabins sagged under the weight of decades, their windows broken and doors hanging crooked, as if they had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. Overgrown paths led to rusted tools and overturned furniture, suggesting that people had fled not gradually, but suddenly. The air in these places carried a stillness that felt almost intentional, a silence preserved like a warning to anyone who wandered too close. Mine shafts, long sealed with concrete and timbers, told a more dangerous story. Locals avoided these places, referring to them only in hushed tones, and the warnings were embedded in folklore disguised as cautionary tales. Some shafts had collapsed inexplicably, leaving sinkholes that swallowed livestock or entire sections of the forest. Others bore marks of hasty sealing, with tools and personal belongings left behind, as though the earth itself had refused to release what had been hidden within it. Maps sometimes marked them with vague labels, but no public record documented why they had been closed or what incidents had occurred inside. Their entrances loomed like wounds in the landscape, reminders that danger and memory could be entwined in the very soil of the mountains. Burned schoolhouses added another layer of tangible evidence. Charred walls and scorched foundations remained, often in towns that otherwise appeared ordinary. Local legends claimed the fires were accidents, caused by faulty stoves or lightning, but the timing frequently coincided with years when records went missing or teachers disappeared. Some elders recalled seeing papers carried from the buildings into the night, never to reappear. The physical destruction of these institutions mirrored the systematic removal of stories, turning education itself into both instrument and casualty of concealment. Even cemeteries bore marks of the hidden history. Some were empty despite generations of residents, while others held unmarked graves clustered in corners overgrown with weeds. Families whispered of relatives who had vanished without explanation or whose deaths were recorded under false names. These sites created a geography of absence, where the land itself refused to tell the stories that had been intentionally buried. The mountains, in effect, became a repository for secrets too volatile to survive in print, where memory persisted through structures and terrain rather than through words. Visiting these locations revealed a truth that documents alone could not convey: the stories were inseparable from the land. Each hollow, mine shaft, and burned building acted as both witness and warning, demonstrating that even when human memory failed or was silenced, the physical world could preserve the residue of what had occurred. The mountains kept their own records, demanding respect and careful observation from anyone who ventured close enough to notice, and making it clear that some histories were never fully erased, only hidden beneath layers of earth, stone, and shadow. Violence in the mountains was never sensational. It was inherited, absorbed, and carried quietly through generations. Unlike the stories of sudden outbursts or isolated crimes that might appear in newspapers, these accounts were embedded in family memory and communal understanding, shaping behavior and belief in ways that textbooks could never teach. Children learned early which places to avoid, which words to leave unspoken, and which eyes to meet only with careful calculation. Fear was less a tool than a legacy, passed down not in lectures but in the rhythm of daily life, a constant undercurrent beneath chores, prayers, and conversation. The violence was not always physical, it was a force that demanded obedience, that punished curiosity, and that ensured silence by whatever means necessary. Families bore the weight of it in their homes. Stories of punishment and retribution were told as cautionary tales, sometimes whispered under blankets at night, sometimes hinted at during arguments or family meetings. A single misstep could ripple outward, affecting neighbors, friends, and cousins who had done nothing but share bloodlines. Communities reinforced these lessons without formal instruction, relying on observation and rumor to maintain order. A child who asked too many questions about a burned cabin, a sealed mine, or a vanished family member was likely to be reminded in ways both subtle and unmistakable that some knowledge carries consequences heavier than curiosity alone can bear. The inheritance of violence was reinforced by geography and isolation. Mountain hollers acted as natural boundaries, constraining where one could go and what one could learn. When combined with the deliberate omissions in schools, the mountains themselves became conduits for lessons in fear. Paths disappeared into brambles, rivers hid dangerous undercurrents, and ridgelines obscured neighboring communities, all subtly teaching vigilance and obedience. Even folklore, framed as moral guidance, carried the echo of actual events, warning that disobedience or deviation could be met with loss, injury, or worse. This transmission was cyclical. Children absorbed the tensions in their homes, internalized the rules of silence, and later reproduced them as adults, either consciously or unconsciously. The violence, though rarely documented in public records, manifested in patterns of behavior, interpersonal relationships, and decision-making that persisted for decades. It shaped marriage, inheritance, land disputes, and local governance in ways that outsiders could rarely perceive. The mountains, in essence, became both classroom and teacher, enforcing a curriculum of restraint, caution, and awareness that could never be captured in print. It was a living history, cruel and inescapable, operating beneath the surface of what outsiders might consider ordinary rural life, and ensuring that those who remembered the stories also remembered how to survive them. The realization that these stories were banned not because they were false, but because they were too accurate, struck with an almost unbearable clarity. What the textbooks omitted, what the teachers were forbidden to teach, and what elders refused to speak of was never myth or exaggeration. The incidents described were rooted in fact, grounded in the daily realities of the mountains, yet they exposed truths that were too uncomfortable, too destabilizing, or too threatening to be allowed into public memory. They revealed patterns of cruelty, injustice, and human failings that those in power preferred to keep hidden, a history that reflected poorly on the institutions, families, and authorities that had shaped the region. The very accuracy of these stories made them dangerous, because they could not be dismissed as mere legend. As the narrator delved deeper, the evidence became undeniable. Eyewitness accounts, personal diaries, and fragmented legal records all converged to form a picture that textbooks had systematically erased. Families had suffered from betrayals, exploitations, and tragedies that were quietly acknowledged in local law but never formally documented. Disappearances, unpunished crimes, and abuses of authority were not just isolated incidents, they were recurring, interconnected events whose patterns challenged the sanitized versions of history taught in classrooms. The real horrors were not the inventions of imagination but the lived experiences of ordinary people struggling against neglect, greed, and violence. This truth cut across generations and social boundaries. The bans and omissions were not intended to protect children from fictional horrors but to shield adults from accountability. Entire communities had learned to live with unspoken shame, while outsiders were kept ignorant. The danger of the stories lay in their power to disrupt the carefully constructed narratives that allowed certain behaviors to persist unchecked. Revealing them threatened reputations, property, and social cohesion, and those who tried to speak or teach them often faced consequences that reinforced the silence. The mountains themselves became a repository of inconvenient truths, where memory survived in whispered stories, physical traces, and the rituals of avoidance. Understanding this gave the narrator a profound sense of the stakes involved. It was not merely a matter of curiosity or folklore, it was a confrontation with reality that generations had been instructed to ignore. To read these stories, even partially, was to confront a history that demanded reckoning, a history whose suppression demonstrated the lengths to which people would go to control narrative, perception, and collective memory. Accuracy, in this context, was itself subversive, a threat that could not be tolerated, and a reminder that what is left unspoken often carries more weight than what is allowed to be told. As the layers of forgotten records, oral testimonies, and physical remnants were pieced together, the line between folklore and documented history began to dissolve, revealing a landscape where legend and fact intertwined so tightly that separating them seemed impossible. The stories that had been whispered for generations in kitchens, at church gatherings, and along narrow mountain trails were not purely imaginative, they carried the residue of real events, often horrifying in their precision. Tales of vanished children, sudden deaths, and unpunished crimes, which had been dismissed in classrooms as exaggerated cautionary tales, aligned too consistently with newspaper clippings, property records, and personal diaries to be mere invention. The more one investigated, the more it became clear that folklore had served as both preservation and camouflage, a means for communities to remember the truth without inviting outside scrutiny or retaliation. This merging of myth and reality created a sense of disorientation. Places described in legend existed exactly as they were described, hollows where entire families disappeared, bridges that seemed cursed because accidents occurred there with disturbing frequency, and mines sealed under circumstances that defied explanation. Maps marked these locations, yet official records remained silent or inconsistent. The stories were neither wholly believable nor entirely implausible. They occupied a liminal space where the mountains themselves appeared to remember what humans had tried to erase. Children learned the lessons instinctively, sensing danger and secrecy in the land around them, even when adults offered only vague explanations. Witnessing the patterns repeat across different communities reinforced the idea that these tales were more than fiction. Similar incidents were reported in counties miles apart, each bearing the hallmarks of the unnamed horrors that had once been actively erased from public memory. While folklore traditionally transforms events into allegory, in this case, it preserved the facts behind coded language, rituals, and warnings. Oral accounts became a living archive, safeguarding knowledge of violence, disappearance, and social transgression. This blending of truth and story challenged the very notion of history as taught in schools. The sanitized version presented in classrooms could not withstand the scrutiny of first-hand recollection, physical evidence, and communal memory. Legends were no longer a comfortable supplement to dry dates and events. They were, in many ways, the only record of what had truly occurred. Understanding this required a new approach, one that accepted ambiguity without dismissing evidence, that honored memory even when it arrived in fragments and shadows. It was a realization that history in these mountains had never been purely objective. The past had been actively curated, its most uncomfortable truths hidden beneath layers of narrative and silence, leaving those willing to dig to confront a reality where folklore and fact were inseparable, each reinforcing the other, each demanding acknowledgement in order to make sense of the present. The deeper the narrator delved into the banned stories, the more apparent it became that recounting them carried a risk far beyond academic curiosity. The consequences of speaking had been demonstrated repeatedly over generations, both subtly and violently, teaching an entire region to practice silence as a form of survival. Families who attempted to share the past in classrooms or public forums were met with repercussions that ranged from social ostracism to economic retaliation, sometimes even accidents or misfortunes that could not be explained by chance. Elders' warnings, once dismissed as superstition, gained weight when coupled with evidence of those who had vanished, or who had been quietly removed from their positions after pressing too far. The act of telling the stories was not merely an academic exercise, it was a deliberate confrontation with forces, social, historical, and perhaps even supernatural, that had enforced the original erasure. This awareness shaped every interaction with the past. The narrator found that even locating physical evidence, like abandoned cabins or sealed mines, demanded discretion. Locals who might otherwise offer guidance hesitated, glancing around before providing fragmented directions or cryptic hints. Their caution was not paranoia, it was inherited knowledge of what happens when a story spreads beyond the bounds of the community. Knowledge itself became a kind of currency, one that could bring danger if mismanaged. The mountains held both memory and warning, a terrain where uncovering the truth required negotiation with the very land, as well as the people who understood its codes. The danger extended to the present as well. By tracing connections between missing records, altered curricula, and oral testimonies, the narrator realized that the forces that suppressed these stories were not entirely inert. Families, institutions, and authorities who had once enforced silence continued to exert influence, consciously or unconsciously, maintaining the boundaries around what could be known. To speak openly was to risk unsettling that fragile balance, to draw attention to patterns that certain people or structures preferred remain invisible. It was a lesson in how power operates through omission as much as through action, and how history itself can become weaponized when knowledge is selectively granted or withheld. This understanding transformed the act of research into a careful negotiation with ethics and memory. The banned stories were not simply curiosities, they were living legacies whose revelation could unsettle communities and individuals alike. The narrator became keenly aware that uncovering the past demanded responsibility, that knowing these truths carried an unspoken obligation to handle them with care. Every detail documented, every testimony recorded, risked echoing the dangers that had once silenced those who dared to remember. The weight of the mountains, the secrecy of the hollers, and the vigilance of the elders all served as reminders that history in these regions was not neutral, and that some stories, once told, had the power to awaken consequences that refused to remain dormant.